In the 1980s, there was a street gang in Chicago that reached a level of power that has never been achieved before or since. And yes, I know the Italian mafia had some incredible heights in their heyday, but I don't think the Gambino crime family ever formed an alliance with the Libyan government to commit acts of domestic terrorism. So this is the story of El Rukn, the Chicago street gang who teamed up with Gaddafi. But our story begins before Gaddafi was even in power, at the St. Charles Institution for Troubled Youth in 1959. It was there that two young men by the names of Jeff Fort and Eugene Hairston formed a gang called the Blackstone Rangers. The gang was originally formed to protect themselves from neighborhood troublemakers, but they soon began merging with other gangs and doing regular gang stuff like drug trafficking. By 1965, Fort and Hairston were overseeing a coalition of 21 gangs who had joined the Blackstone Rangers. But they really took it to the next level when they joined forces with a Presbyterian minister named Reverend John Fry. Yeah, they've had some weird allies over the years. Reverend Fry saw the opportunity to turn the Blackstone Rangers into a legitimate political movement in the south side of Chicago. I guess when he called himself a man of the cloth, he was talking about bandanas. Around this same time, Eugene Hairston was sent to prison on drug charges, so Jeff Fort took complete control of the Rangers and renamed them the Black Pea Stone Nation, or BPSN for short. Really rolls off the tongue. And while he wasn't good at names, Jeff Fort was a natural leader. A man who knew him later said, if you could have turned Jeff Fort around in the early days, the man could have been mayor of Chicago or something. He was that dynamic. But instead of being the mayor, Jeff Fort continued expanding the BPSN, with Reverend Fry acting as some kind of religious consigliere. The good Reverend let the Rangers use his church for their meetings and provided church resources to help the gang. So if you see a gang member wearing a Presbyterian Geneva gown, you'll know who you're dealing with. Weirdly enough, the BPSN even put together a musical in collaboration with the singer-songwriter Oscar Brown Jr. It was performed by gang members in Reverend Fry's church and was called Opportunity Please Knock. And it was actually extremely well received, with the show traveling to a few other cities as well. Glad there was an extracurricular activity for the theater lovers in this street gang. But beyond hosting a musical and donating clergy robes, Reverend Fry's greatest contribution involved the group's finances. In 1967, he helped Jeff Fort obtain grant money from a local nonprofit called the Woodlawn Organization. This charity would then distribute the money to the BPSN with very little oversight. This began with a $50,000 grant from a charity funded by General Motors, which the BPSN used to pay bail for the gang members who were arrested, making it the worst thing GM ever did outside of the Pontiac Aztek. But the real treasure came from the Office of Economic Opportunity, a government agency created by Lyndon B. Johnson as part of the War on Poverty. And to fight this war on poverty, the agency gave a $1 million federal grant to a Chicago street gang. Well, that should solve the problem. Of course, they were actually giving the money to the Woodlawn Organization, and the idea behind the grant was to teach useful labor skills to gang members. And who better to teach these young gang members than the gang leaders of the Black Pea Stone Nation, who were employed by the program as instructors and project directors, being paid the modern equivalent of $50,000 to $65,000 a year. The gang members attending these classes were then paid the equivalent of $450 a week. Of course, the classes themselves were completely useless, if they even existed at all, as the BPSN was just pocketing the money. The gang even forced local children to drop out of school, go to the classes, and give a kickback of their weekly salary to the gang. Love to see a government program that stimulates the local economy. At this point, the BPSN was basically invincible. So much so that in 1969, Jeff Fort was even invited to Richard Nixon's inaugural ball. Well, that's one way to kick off the presidency. But perhaps in an even bigger power move, Jeff Fort actually declined to go and sent his lieutenant Mickey Cogwell in his place. Sorry, Mr. President, but I have a musical to run. Unfortunately, the good times did not last for the Black Pea Stone Nation. The Chicago Police Department was furious that the gang had been given $1 million in grant money, so they created the Gang Intelligence Unit to investigate where the money was going. And in 1969, they realized that the grant money was going directly to gang members and no actual teaching was being done. They also discovered that the Presbyterian Church was being used for gang meetings and as a place for the gang to smoke weed and have sex. Presumably with women, although it's hard to say considering how much they enjoyed that musical. When Jeff Fort was subpoenaed by the Senate, he showed up, introduced himself, didn't answer a single question, and then left, which is somehow worse than not showing up at all. He was convicted of contempt of Congress, but the whole investigation didn't wrap up until 1972, when Jeff Fort was convicted of misusing federal funds and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The Reverend John Fry, who was even accused of relaying a murder charge on behalf of the gang, actually managed to escape all charges. After the investigation, he moved out of state and began publishing a social justice magazine called Frying Pan. Very nice. He may have single-handedly expanded Chicago's street crime for generations, but the man knew his way around a pun. For most gangs, this is where the story would end. But this is actually the moment that everything becomes much weirder. Because while Jeff Fort was in federal prison, he converted to Islam and changed his name to Abdul Malik Kaba, which means Reverend Fry really failed on multiple levels when he took Jeff Fort under his wing. Mickey Cogwell had been running the gang in Jeff Fort's absence. I know Jeff changed his name, but it's easier than calling him Abdul Malik Kaba for the rest of the video. When Fort was released in 1976, he spent some time in Milwaukee as part of his parole. There he joined the Moorish Science Temple of America, a black Muslim religious organization based in the Midwest. And while the Black Pea Stone Nation had started to splinter in his absence, Jeff Fort returned to Chicago in 1978 and aggressively took back control. He announced that Mickey Cogwell and the other generals were now enemies of the gang, which led to Mickey Cogwell's murder. One day you're shaking hands with Richard Nixon, and the next you're being assassinated because your boss converted to Islam. The ups and downs of working for a Chicago street gang. Jeff Fort then changed the name of the gang from the Black Pea Stone Nation to the Rukn Tribe of the Moorish Science Temple. This guy really needs to learn a thing or two about catchy branding. Don Draper he was not. Rukn loosely translates to the pillar in Arabic, a reference to the Kaaba in Mecca. The ultimate black stone. See what they did there? I guess Jeff learned a thing or two about puns from Reverend Fry. Jeff Fort purchased the Oakland Square Theater, a movie theater which had been vacant since the 50s, and turned it into the headquarters for Rukn, renaming it the Fort. I would think he was naming it after himself, but I guess he didn't name it Abdul Malik Kaba. Despite the claims that their leader found salvation in the Quran, Rukn continued engaging in drug trafficking. It was clear that Jeff Fort learned from his Presbyterian days that it was much harder for law enforcement to run surveillance on religious organizations. I don't mean to doubt his devotion to Islam. I'm sure he was praying 5 times a day throughout all of this. In the following years, the influence of Rukn continued to grow, but the public opinion had fallen from the days when they were putting on musicals and pretending to be a legitimate part of the community. In 1983, they were involved in a scandal when it was revealed that someone from Mayor Jane Byrne's re-election campaign had given Rukn $10,000 to promote the campaign. I guess that's one way to get the South Side vote. Rukn went on to pocket the money and endorse Byrne's opponent. I mean, come on, you can't expect them to endorse a candidate who would give money to a bunch of criminals. But by far the biggest controversy that Rukn was involved in concerned none other than Muammar Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya. And to make the whole thing even more unlikely, it happened while Jeff Fort was in prison. The FBI finally convicted him of drug trafficking charges in 1983, sentencing him to 13 years in prison. In retrospect, converting to Islam was probably not the best way to get the government off your back. And although he was imprisoned in Bastrop, Texas, he was still running Rukn from behind bars. His chief lieutenant Melvin Mays was managing the gang in Chicago, and he would communicate with Jeff Fort via phone calls in prison. Typically this was about drug trafficking or gang conflict, but in 1985 it took a turn. By this time, Muammar Gaddafi was already at odds with the United States. which would only last another 26 years. In the midst of this growing tension, Gaddafi stoked the flame by giving an interest-free $5 million loan to Louis Farrakhan, the head of the American religious organization, the Nation of Islam. The intention of this loan was for Farrakhan to create a black-owned toiletries company called Power. And if you're wondering what happened to that company, have you ever heard of a little something called Axe body spray? Well, they have nothing to do with this. The company failed and the loan was never repaid. Gaddafi apparently also offered to send Farrakhan a huge shipment of weaponry to begin a black nation, but Farrakhan decided deodorant was the way to go. Either way, Jeff Fort heard about this and decided that he wanted in on the whole interest-free loan from Libya thing. So he had his men reach out to the Libyan government and offer their services as criminals in exchange for money. And it seems the Libyans were interested. Jeff Fort began sending his lieutenants to New York to meet with the Libyans at their United Nations mission. These meetings expanded into El Rukn members traveling to Libya to speak with the government directly. You've heard of Chirac, now welcome to Chibia. Sorry, that one was really bad. The good news is that the dynamic leaders of our story, Jeff Fort and Muammar Gaddafi, did in fact speak to each other. Melvin Mays got Gaddafi on a call, hooked his phone up to a speaker system, and then called Jeff Fort so the two could talk. The only thing we know they said for sure was Assalamu alaikum. Wow. Am I the only one with chills right now? Obviously, the feds were listening in to every conversation that Jeff Fort was having from prison. El Rukn solved this by using a complex code to hide their discussions. And to be honest, most of the conversations were pretty dull. Like when Jeff Fort chewed out some gang members for racking up a high electricity bill, saying, quote, "In the daytime we don't need no lights on. Brothers is looking at the TV all night long. They just leaving it on." And that's a valid complaint from Jeff. They should really be more conscious of that stuff. But as the cops struggled to decipher the code about drug trafficking, they picked up on enough information to realize that El Rukn was working with Libya. The gang referred to Gaddafi as their young friend, and said that he was paying them 2 dinners and a lunch, meaning $2.5 million. That's right, the Libyans agreed to give $2.5 million to El Rukn, and all they asked for in exchange was a few acts of domestic terrorism. Gaddafi was seemingly trying to assemble an army from inside the United States, so he instructed the gang to purchase military weaponry. And that was when the FBI got involved. They had an undercover agent meet with Melvin Mays in a hotel room in Lansing, Michigan, and sell him a weapon. And that weapon was not some pistol or automatic rifle, it was an M72 Law, an anti-tank rocket capable of shooting down a plane. The feds, of course, had disabled the weapon before selling it, and considering each M72 can only be used once, you can't exactly test it before you buy it. So Mays went through with the purchase, and that was enough for the FBI to get a search warrant and raid the fort. There they found 35 weapons, including 3 machine guns. And all of this culminated in the arrest of multiple El Rukn generals, all set to go on trial alongside their boss Jeff Fort. The Libyans, for their part, denied having anything to do with this. Their deputy envoy to the UN said, "We don't know anything about these people. This is the first time I've heard of this. We know nothing at all. And while we have your attention, please consider purchasing Power deodorant." In the trial, an El Rukn member by the name of Tremel Davis took a plea deal and helped the police translate all the coded conversations they had recorded. Finally, we can find out if Jeff was complaining about the sewage bill too. In the end, Jeff Fort and his men became the first Americans to be convicted for conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. Unless they could manage to put on the best musical this town has ever seen. Jeff Fort was sentenced to 80 years in prison, which the judge said was intended to deter others from doing the same. So you better think twice before you conspire with the Libyan government, call their dictator from prison, and buy a rocket launcher used in the Vietnam War. Melvin Mays actually fled the country before he was captured, living in Libya for years before being arrested in a Southside apartment in 1995. Yeah, I would have stayed in Libya, but the White Sox were going on a run for a while there, and I just had to see it. Jeff Fort spent several years in an Illinois federal prison, but I guess the government worried he was still in communication with El Rukn, so in 2006 he was transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, where he's been under an order of no human contact for the last 20 years. But I do hope they let him shoot the shit with fellow inmate El Chapo just once. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. In the years since the big sting, the remnants of El Rukn have splintered into various subgroups, all of them blending into the larger Chicago gang scene. And while they fight for control of their city's underground to this day, they'll never forget the one time a charismatic, born-again Muslim helped take them international. Now please consider subscribing, or I'll cast you in a Chicago church musical about the events of this video. And yes, you'll be playing Gaddafi.